My name is Stephen Berkley, and along with my colleague Kavya Rasu, we'll be hosting this conversation today. And our conversation is on working with values for organisational growth, lessons learnt from the field. First of all, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I stand today, and that is the Turrbal and Jagera people. And I pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And one of the core values of the First Nations people here in Australia is reverence for land. Land and country is very important to our First Nations people here. And I invite you to reflect on your own First Nations people and what their core values, specific ones that stand out. This today is the first in a series of webinars that Flyntrok is holding, bringing perspectives from around the world on a range of different subjects, including values, learning, transitions and change. And our whole idea is to host conversations to draw out perspectives, and particularly with this subject around values. And we believe here at Flyntrok, there's many different ways to work with values. And one of the ways in which we hold very close to us is through conversations and stories. So our idea with this series of working with values, and we've got we've had a number of interviews, and all of the panelists today have been included and have been interviewed so far, and hopefully some of you have had a chance to see those interviews. And it's bringing together some of the best minds in the world to have a conversation and share their perspectives around values. And so today's guest that we have with us, with great pleasure.
In progress.
Is that me? Great. Great pleasure to welcome our guest today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Gentile, coming in from the US. She's the creator and the director of Giving Voice to Values. We've had Mary on with us before, and also one of our guests on the interview series. Stela Lupushor, she is the chief reframer at Reframe Work, and she's also the author of a number of books. And so is Mary. Mary is the author of too many books to list. It'll take me to the end of the day. And her two books are Humanizing Human Capital and Humans at Work. And also Vivek Padwadhan is coming in from India today. He's a respected HR, IR and OD consultant, and he's the former executive vice president of HR at Asian Paints. So first of all, and the flow of today's program, we're going to be asking a series of questions of our panelists. We also, if you've got any questions of our panelists, if you can just type that in to the chat, and we'll feed that into the conversation. And just before I go, Kavi, anything else that you wanted to add about our webinar series and about today's conversation?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to all the wonderful panelists that we have, and I think we should get started right away.
Great, thank you. So the first question that we're interested in from our guests today is if you could just introduce yourselves to us and to the audience, and but particularly we'd love to know a story about what got you interested in values in the first place. What piqued your interest? What was that critical moment that made you really realize that this is an important subject to pay attention to? Mary, do you want to kickstart us off?
Sure. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be sharing this conversation with you, Stephen and Kavi, but Vivek and Stella as well. I'm Mary Gentile. I'm the creator and director of something called Giving Voice to Values, which is an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. It's based on the idea that rather than focusing on simply presenting dilemmas and encouraging people to debate what the right thing to do is, or presenting models of ethical reasoning to help them figure out what's right. Those are all good things, but giving voice to values is about actually sharing scenarios with people where they know what the right thing to do is, and the question is, how do you get it done? So it's a methodology for rehearsing, pre-scripting, practicing, peer coaching. And in terms of, and it's being used all over the world in businesses and business schools and across professions. So in terms of the question about how I got interested in values, I think it's because I've always been kind of an earnest person. I would notice things that I thought were wrong, but I was also an introvert, kind of shy, and also maybe someone who wasn't that comfortable in sort of debating, arguing with people. And so I sort of thought I was doomed to be able to be someone who sees things wrong, but doesn't do anything about them. And it was somewhat tormenting. And so when I came up with and came across some of the research around the effectiveness of rehearsal and practice and peer coaching as a way to have an impact on people's behavior, it was a light bulb for me. And it not only was something that I felt I could share with others, but it's really helped me to be able to enact my values more often as well.
Thanks,
So I'd
Mary.
love to hear from you, Stella. Same question.
Absolutely. So my name is Stela Lupushor. As Stephen mentioned, the title was a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek when I launched the company, because I felt like CEOs and president and all of these titles are too non-fitting to my personality. So I thought I'll have some fun with the naming. So I gave myself a title, Chief Reframer. I posted the update on LinkedIn, and a day later I got a request from Adam Munoz to connect, who is a window framer. So I said, finally, I found my tribe. But really, at the core of what I do is I help organizations think differently about the work environment and creating a better workplace experience through the use of technology, analytics, and human-centered design thinking. I teach the same kind of principles and concepts at NYU to the next generation of HR leaders, studying human capital analytics and technology masters. And as Stephen mentioned, I have a couple of books where I try to convey that human centricity and how important it is to bring it to the world of workers. We've been really focusing on bringing that experience to consumers, and we as consumers know what it feels and looks like. However, as employees, we are really lacking that great experience. I think technology has a great opportunity to improve it. Analytics and data-driven decision-making can improve it. And the more we as HR practitioners can embed some of those practices in our day-to-day activities and not think through the lens of HR processes, but think through the lens of workers, the better we'll be able to support the organization to create value. And that value creation is what brought me to the world of values, because I look at it through the organizational drivers of value creation. And it led me to understanding that there is a difference between the economic value versus philosophical value, and how I think the world of work really has the opportunity to create the bridge between the two, because it's a value exchange between workers and what they bring to the table and what organizations gives them. So that's where the greatest opportunity for next generation of value creation that can emerge for organizations. So Vivek, I think I've had enough of this stage. Your time.
Thank you, Stella. I'm Vivek Patwardhan, and I have had a career of almost 37 years in the field of people management. Initially in industrial relations, subsequently in human resource management. And when you deal with people, you handle conflicts every day, or you at least see conflicts every day. To cap it all, I was appointed as TISCO Chair Professor of Industrial Relations by Tata Institute of Social Sciences here. And I used to teach conflict management. One of the things which I realized is that both the parties in conflict, they think they are right thinking members of the society and they hold high values, but they are in deep conflict. Okay. So that kind of generated my interest in values, and I kept on thinking and reading about it. That's the thing. And if you are in, I also watched the conflicts and value conflicts between individuals and individuals and between groups and groups. For example, when managements and unions, they have conflicts, it's between two groups, and whereas individual to individual, we are fairly conversant with that. So that all generated my interest in values. That's where we are. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Vivek. It reminded me, one of the 7 pillars that Mary has talked about in the Giving Voice to Values is about the normalization of values conflict.
Yeah.
Mary, would you just like to talk a little bit more about that and why that, how that adds value when you normalize values conflicts?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Actually, the idea occurred to me because I was interviewing a gentleman. When I was creating Giving Voice to Values, I interviewed a lot of people in business, from people right out of school all the way up to C-suite executives, to ask them about, you know, how they experienced values conflicts, what they did with them. And I remember speaking to this one gentleman. He worked for a firm that acquired a lot of other companies, and his job was usually to interface with the CEO and the CFO of the companies that were being acquired, because, you know, the negotiations for these kinds of transactions sometimes would take, you know, a year. It was a lot of conversation. And he told me that one time he was working with a company. They were near the end of the process. They were about to acquire the company. And he had spent 2 days with the CEO and CFO of the company that was being acquired, and they were at the airport having a glass of wine and about to fly off in different directions. And the CEO turned to him and said, "So, okay, now be honest with us. What's really going to happen to us when this deal goes through? Are we going to be losing our jobs? Will we be able to maintain the roles that we thought we've negotiated?" And the gentleman I was interviewing said that, you know, he was torn because he'd become friends with these guys, and he had a trusting relationship with them. And he also didn't want to antagonize them at this point in the deal. But on the other hand, he knew that whatever he may or may not know about what was going to happen, he had a responsibility not to reveal that. And so he wasn't really sure what to say. And I said, "Well, what did you say?" And he said, "Well, he said, I lied." And then he paused and he looked at me and he said, "You know, instinctively, I lied." He said, "But then I went home and I thought about it. And I thought, you know, if I keep doing this work, this question's going to come up every time. And I can lie every time, or I can see it as just a normal part of doing business. And I can take an hour or two and sit down and come up with a script, something I can say that's actually substantive, that would be helpful to these individuals, that's honest, but that doesn't reveal something that I might have a fiduciary responsibility not to reveal." And so he said he worked on it. He wrote a little script, and he talked about how, you know, even if I knew the answer to this question, I couldn't tell you. But what I can tell you is what I've seen over the years of what you can be doing now that's going to position you in the best way possible, no matter what happens. And he said he started using that script when this question would come up. And he said, you know, people weren't thrilled. They wanted him to say yes or no, but they got it. And he was able to maintain a respectful relationship with them because he'd actually worked at coming up with something that was a gift to them, that was useful to them. And he said to me, "You know, Mary, I realize that this is just a normal part of doing business. And so if I see it as exceptional and this deer in headlights moment, you know, where you freeze and you just lie instinctively," he said, I don't have to see it that way. I can actually bring the emotion down, see it as normal, and respond to it in an effective and an honest and a helpful way. And so that was sort of the inspiration for me, that we needed to give people the opportunity to rehearse and practice how to deal with these situations, so that instead of freezing and becoming less competent than they really are, they could actually draw on all their own skills for communications, negotiations, problem reframing, Stella, etc. So that was the origin of the idea of normalization as a pillar, that those people who get used to this, who don't see it as the exceptional moment, can tap into all their skills and strengths.
Thanks very much, Mary. We've noticed in all of our conversations with people around values that there appears to be two schools of thought. And one of those schools of thought is that values are really important. They lay the foundation with respect to the company's culture, and it helps them understand what are the behaviours that they really feel will drive efficiency and effectiveness within the organisation. Then you've got the other school of thought that believes organisation values are overhyped. There's no such thing as shared values. They're undermanaged, they're very tangible, and they don't believe that they're very important. Now, the future is already amongst us. We've got AI, we've got hybrid working, we've got a range of things. We'd love to know your thoughts around or your views around the role of values, both in the present and in the future. Stella, do you want to kick us off on that?
Absolutely. I'll take a pass, and I know that each of the esteemed panelists will have significant depth as well to contribute here. So when we think about values, right? Value at the core is the capacity of a good or service or activity to satisfy a need or provide a benefit to a person or legal entity. All right, so when we think about philosophical values, right, is the meaning and significance of norms that are held by human guiding of their behaviors. In economic terms, it's the norms that play a role in life of the organization, and you can have value attributed to things, to activities, to policies, to practices. And when we think about values in use, right, there are things that we cannot live without, like water, that has a certain value, or we can have value that is in terms of the exchange, right? So think of diamonds and the value we attribute to diamonds because of the scarcity and marketing and monopolization and everything else. So at the core, value, for a value to exist, it has to exist in the eye of the beholder, right? So when we think about organizations, the reason why organizations set up and establish values is to have some boundaries, some guardrails, some guiding North Star for all the employees to be able to align and understand the core, the tenets of the DNA of the organization. And I think from that perspective is a very important structure, as long as it is not just espoused values, and it's something that it's on a wall and it's to be believed by everybody else, but not necessarily by the leadership or some of the role modeling entities inside the organization. If values are really defined and embraced and lived and demonstrated and debated, those are the values that really bring a significant contribution to alignment across the organization, regardless of the cultural backgrounds, the business that the business unit represents, the markets they're playing in, right? So these are the common guidelines for the entire organization to bring the culture together. When people debate that values matter, I would start thinking about your own individual personal reason for why you come to work, right? Some people come to earn an income, I hope most of you. Some people may not necessarily use that as a significant criteria to make a decision. There are people who want to have an opportunity to grow their skill or attain their title, ideal title that they had in mind, or contribute to the society in a positive way, or be proud of the products the company produces, all of those are indications of values, individual values, that then I expect the company to provide me in exchange of me coming and bringing my talent, giving up my time, giving up my personal interests to be able to be part of that value creation. Those are tangible things that are easy to define, that are relatively easy to quantify, and that are really easy to use in the decision-making process as to what the company employment values are and what is it that we want to create for those who are here or those who want to come and join us. So yes, while values may be perceived as somewhat intangible, fuzzy, they're relatively easy to deconstruct and decompose into very quantifiable elements that then can be very directly linked to the bottom line. It's like if you don't invest in the development of your workforce, they're more likely than not will not be able to address the customer needs and lead to low NPS score. If you're not investing in talent retention and you have a revolving door, more likely than not, your reputation externally is going to be impacted, and you'll not be able to attract talent who is seeking stability and longevity. You will probably have a tough time replacing and maintaining the productivity level. So all of this can be translated into direct business outcomes that will draw the attention of business leaders and CFOs and the C-suite. So it is a point of view from the perspective of the organization, but I'm sure as you get down to team level and to individual level or in the conflict level, I'm sure Mary, you and Vivek will have a lot more to add to this. Mary, do you have?
Oh, sure. But I was going to say maybe Vivek might want to go first because I've already been speaking. So I'm happy to talk after Vivek if he wants to join.
Sounds good. You're on mute, Vivek, by the way.
You're on mute, Vivek.
The value of the voice you
Yeah.
have is in being heard.
So true. Some thoughts of mine on what you have asked, Stephen, is, and these are random thoughts, but I hope they are connected. First and foremost, in family, we do not define values, but we absorb values. Okay. So we work in organization. I wonder whether values evolve or values need to be prescribed. Okay. So I think it is both. It is not one. Okay. Values keep evolving because organizations also go through certain conflicts. And maybe conflicts with the environment, maybe internal conflicts, but these leave mark on the psyche of people. So this is one aspect, whether values evolve or whether values can be prescribed. And my understanding is the operating values like customer satisfaction or look at employees or these things are something that companies prescribe, and those can continue. But the fundamental values of relating to people and building relationships, which are also ethical values, okay, they keep evolving. And they keep evolving because people come and go in an organization. Unlike family, where people are steady, I mean, the same set of people are there in the family. But in organizations, people come and go. If the leader is there for a long time, then he makes an impact. But in modern day organizations, leaders seem to be coming and going at 3 years interval or 5 years interval. Then what happens to the organization? Okay, each person is bringing something new, something different. May not be bad, but it's different. And this is why some dialogues about values need to happen. So I'm actually saying both. On one side, values seem to evolve, and Dr. Mary and Stela can add to that. And on the other side, we also need to stipulate some values that need to be practiced. My understanding is that those need to be prescribed. Okay. The third aspect is what happens to organizations as responsible corporate citizens. I mean, how many organizations really stipulate those kind of values? Okay. That needs to be also checked, because increasingly we are coming in for times where environment and social responsibility are in limelight. So these are some of my thoughts actually.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, when I look back at the question that Stephen posed, where he talked about how there seem to be two schools of thought, and some who different than the schools of thought you're talking about, Vivek, I think, but talking
Yeah.
about some who say values are absolutely essential. Stella, I think you made a good case for that, and others who are saying no, you can't act according to your values. One of the things that I think is that for those folks who devalue values, who say it's impossible, who say that, you know, there's no way to be effective in your organizations if you try and worry about that, I think that often comes from a place where it comes from a place of fear. I think it comes from a place of not believing it's possible to be a values-driven leader, manager, contributor. I think they feel they're afraid of being taken advantage of. They're afraid of being left behind. And I think that I think it's unfortunate. I think it's kind of sad, because I do believe what Stella was laying out in terms of the contributions that you can make when you're a truly values-driven, values-led organization. And that's why in the work that I do, I really try and focus on sharing examples of how people have, in fact, acted on their values effectively in stressful and sometimes conflicted situations, and to give people the opportunity to develop that capacity. Because I think once that capacity becomes more comfortable, more natural, people become more confident, it begins to address that sense of it's just not possible, or that fear that they can't succeed if they worry about those kinds of values.
Can I comment on something that came up in the chat, which I think is an important part of the conversation? And James, you alluded to the fact that, yes, on one side, values are considered as guardrails and kind of top-down direction to shape the culture, as opposed to something that people get energized and rallied around and create a more positive perspective around the values, not something that is just leadership driven. One aspect and one important aspect of values is to make them owned by the individuals, by the employees, right? So one example I can give from my past experience at IBM, there was an effort around the 100-year celebration of IBM's longevity, where there was an acknowledgement that we've survived 100 years, what the next might look like, and how can we survive, how can we adapt, what is it that makes us as IBM an organization that can navigate the changes in technology and the customer expectations, etc. And there was an effort bottoms up to generate and come up with values for the company. So there was a series of ideations, a series of jams where people contributed around the world, and it got distilled into nine values. But then the effort to make them personal was a whole separate exercise, because people need to understand, okay, when we know what the value is, but how that shows up in my market, in my business unit, for me, what type of behaviors should I exhibit? And that's a series of conversation that may not necessarily be possible to convey top down. It has to come up, bottoms up, and has to be something that people then are guided on the ground, because what's needed and what's important in how that value shows up in India may be very different than how it shows up in the US, may be very different than how it shows up in Europe. So the more you as a team engage in understanding what that value means for us as a team, or for me as an individual, the more likely the person will get excited and will be able to communicate and demonstrate the success of that value in action.
So true.
Thank you. And I know Vivek, you've had experience in with respect to mergers and acquisitions of companies in different organizations and that whole process.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't get your question.
Yeah, so you've had that experience with respect
Yes.
to mergers and acquisitions and
Yes.
and that sense of alignment of values and the process that you've gone through.
Yes.
Can you tell us a
Yes.
little bit about your experience, particularly in operationalizing those values? Because it's a really interesting story of that
Yeah.
you've had there.
Yes. Yes. So what happened is actually my company acquired another company which had operations in 13 different countries. So one had to move from West Indies to Fiji. And I actually held value discussions on value conversations in 8 different countries. And each was a very different experience. And first and foremost, when you acquire a company, there is a sense of fear there. Okay, so I mean, what's going to happen to us, and are we going to lose job? Are we going to transform this company completely? And what's new coming up? So there is a lot of anxiety around it. So when you start talking of values, which we call guiding principles, really, okay, it kind of gave them some kind of an assurance that well, things will move this way, and that we can talk about these things. So that was a good part of it. Second thing which I noticed is that there were cultural determinants to how people responded. So people responded to a certain situation in West Indies very differently from the way they responded very differently in, say, Malaysia or the Asian countries, I would say. Okay, the responses were quite different. So we also realized that we need to actually hold different kind of conversations in different countries. So that was another aspect. So these were some of the insights. What we also realized is that value discussions remain theoretical unless you come out with something that enters the process. Just to highlight what I'm trying to say is the best example is, I mean, I can give you 2 examples. The best example is, and well-known example is that of Amazon. So when they hold a meeting, if there are 10 people in the room, there are 11 chairs. So 1 chair is empty. And they say that customer is sitting there and be aware customer is watching you. So see how they have actually operationalized the value aspect of it. So what I realize, and there are companies which actually involve customers in actually design of products these days. What I am saying is that people have moved from simply defining values to operationalizing those values, and they have methods of creating processes around it. So in that sense, there is a big development, and otherwise things remain as pure discussions, and we need to march on from that.
Yeah, I like what you were saying, Vivek, because that's really the origin of the work that I do too, that you know, I talk that often when we talk about values in organizations, I call it the preach and pretend method. You know, we preach about what's the right thing to do, and then we pretend people can do it. And you know, you have to go beyond that. You have to actually give people an opportunity to engage with scenarios that are relevant to their everyday lives, and then work collaboratively to try and develop solutions for them. And that's when it begins to feel more embedded and more true to the self of the employees.
Very true. Very true.
Thanks. I'm loving the energy coming through from.
Can I raise a question, if you don't mind?
Sure,
Stephen. Okay. I'm very curious, and my question is to everybody here. I'm very curious how some very difficult situations leave a mark on organization psyche and obviously on values. For example, okay, uh, a company suddenly going into losses and staying there for a couple of years or maybe and crawling back to profits again. Okay, what happens to a successful company suddenly experiencing a failure, and you know in what way their working methods or the values they practice change?
It's interesting. I just came from some conversations recently with representatives from a variety of companies that were dealing with. I'm in the U.S. and they were dealing with some of the political context in the U.S. right now, where there have been some public sector officials who have actually attacked various large public companies when those companies didn't align with the particular politicians' views or perspectives. And what was interesting is that the individuals I was speaking with, who all were very strongly connected to their values and the values that they believe their companies held around a number of issues, whether it was sustainability or whether it was inclusion or whatever it was, they were saying that there was this fear that was leading many of their companies to pull back from values-driven positions that they had committed to previously, because they were seeing what was happening to other companies. And these individuals were saying that they really didn't think in all cases it was necessary for these companies to react that way. But there's this contagion of fear that led them to be more conservative, and I mean conservative in the sense of careful, and to pull back from their own values-driven positions. But there was one representative there from one major corporation who said that that was their initial thought, but that they then decided no, they were going to go on the offense, and so that they were actually going to do more of what we would normally maybe have some reservations about in terms of company lobbying, but they were going to actually go and visit states in the US where maybe they would normally not even visit because they didn't think that they really related to their business. But it was where some of these politicians who were pushing against some of the policies, that the values-driven policies that the company had. So they were actually going out and saying, we're going to actually communicate more. We're going to go on and speak with these individuals. And I thought that was impressive. And so it sort of showed there's kind of two responses that I see. That often I think the first reaction is this kind of pulling back and fearfulness that leads organizations to perhaps pull back from their values. But when they can sort of take their breath and sort of reestablish some confidence that there's an opportunity there to actually go on the offense and communicate and engage in more of a public conversation. And that's beginning to happen here in the States anyways.
Thank you.
And it's a brilliant example, Mary. If I can add a little bit more related to the layoff trends that were happening in the technology industry, right? It started with 1 or 2 or 3, and then it became kind of a snowball effect and spilled into other industries. And we probably vividly remember the news around layoffs at Twitter and how that was handled and how much that impacted the brand image and just the perception around the treatment of employees at Twitter. And compare that and contrast to the same layoff that had to happen in other companies, and one in particular, Stripe, right? It's technology company. It's also a startup that grew very fast. And the way the CEO handled it was very different. It was their public communication explaining that they overhired, and the CEO took the accountability for making those decisions and explain very clearly, this is what's happened to you. If you have a visa, if you're here on a visa, here's how we're going to treat you and what's going to happen as a next step. So there was a very different way of handling exactly the same situation, which every business will go through its cycle, but how you handle these moments of truth, I think is going to
Yeah.
shape the long
Very true.
term, how the company is going to be respected later.
Right.
Thank you. I mean, there's lots of amazing comments and great energy coming through on the chat. So thank you, everybody, for your insights and your questions. And it's interesting that Atul has raised an interesting question. It was going to be my next question. And what I've noticed in my conversations with all three of you that we've published and with others in the Working with Values series is the red thread amongst it is the power of conversations and developing those skills within our organizations. And Atul has asked the question around what is the role of storytelling in organizations in socializing and energizing those values. Be interested to hear your points of view on that. Mary, what are your thoughts there?
I love it that you and I guess one of our commenters raised the issue of storytelling. I think storytelling is fundamental, is so important. It's how leaders communicate what's possible. It's how they communicate what their aspirations are, and it's also really important for everyone throughout the organization. One of the things that I use in the work that all of my work is based on stories, gathering stories from individuals about times when they've encountered values conflicts, and times when they've found ways to act on their values and times when they've not found ways to act on their values, and to try and distill from that, what were the tools that made it possible, what were the strategies, what were the scripts, and what were the disablers that made it so difficult, and what might we learn about ways to counter those. One of the key exercises that I use when I go into organizations as well as when I work in educational institutions is something I call a tale of two stories, where I invite people to reflect individually, privately, about a time when they themselves encountered a significant values conflict in their work lives, and they found a way to effectively act on their values. And then I ask them to answer some questions about that. What motivated them? What were the enablers? What made it easier? And what were the disablers and that made it harder? And how did they overcome them? And how they feel about it now? And then I asked them to think about a time when they encountered a values conflict and they failed to act effectively. And then to answer the same questions about motivations and enablers and disablers. And then we bring them together for small group debriefs and large group debriefs. And it's fascinating what comes up in these conversations. First of all, people begin to learn what makes it easier for them personally to act effectively, because you can often frame a conflict in a way that will play to your strengths. Often people think that something comes up and they have to, have this sort of speak out, shake their fist, stomp their foot, but they start to learn from looking at their own experiences and those of others that there's often other ways to do this. And so they begin to understand what their own particular strengths are. The other thing that comes out is that they also begin to realize what are the things that pretty much enable everybody or disable everybody, because those become important things to think about when you're building the culture of your organization. Those are the kinds of, you want to build in the enablers, you want to mitigate the disablers. And so I think using stories in that way to understand what makes something possible. Often people think of stories as a way to inspire action, and I think that's true. But I also think it's a way to help people understand action and to begin to understand what makes it possible. The last thing I'll say about that is one of the things that I've used I remember the first time we did this was with McKinsey, where we were trying to raise issues around values and leadership. And we asked leaders in the organization to think about times when they had encountered significant values conflicts, and then to share the story, but not in a, what a good girl am I or what a good boy am I kind of way, but rather to share the struggle, to tell the story in a way that made it clear that it was hard for them and what they were afraid of and what they were scared of, but then also to share how they worked it through. And when they do that, it does so many things. I mean, first of all, it indicates that they take values seriously because they struggled with them. it makes them more approachable, more human, so that other people won't feel so afraid to raise issues with them because they know they experience them in the same way. And then it's also a teaching moment because they do share how they worked through the particular challenge. And so I think stories are useful in all of those ways and probably many more.
Thanks, Mary. And there's another interesting idea and question that's coming up in the chat from Marcel, sorry, with respect to the intergenerational values and how one manages that or looks at that or addresses that. Stella, I know that this is something that's dear to your heart.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that?
Absolutely. I think we've grown, or we've been trained because of how statistics is designed to assume that our life is linear, right? You early in your life, you go to school, then you get your first occupation, then you move through management roles, then you eventually retire and move into sunset, as opposed to saying we have a variety of pathways that we take throughout the lifetime, through education, through the through what matters to us at that specific point in our life and career. And it's not to say that if you're young, you may have very different values than when you're old. Yes, the nuances may differ, but at the core, we all want to be respected. We all want to be treated with dignity, to have access to opportunities, to have the ability to grow. So there are certain fundamental things that it doesn't matter what generation, not to say that generational divides are real to begin with, right? But the more we can think about the specific of life stage and what might be necessary, not through the lens of age, but life stage, that's where we'll be able to get a more nuanced view of the values and needs, right? As I mentioned in my response on the chat, flexibility, for example, is one important thing that may not necessarily be just for young parents or for older people. It's important when we care for somebody. It's important when we're burnt out and we need a break. So the more we can think about what matters to whom at what point in time in their life stage, and not assume that just because you're of a certain age, you will have very different needs, and pigeonhole millennials or Generation Z in very different categories. The more inclusive we'll be in our design of and living the values.
Yeah, thank you, Stella. And another theme is around that's coming out of the chat is around, how do you make these values living? And what I'm particularly interested in, Vivek, and I know that you sort of alluded to this a little bit, is around that there's one aspect about talking about values at an organizational level, but how does, say, a team that's really interested in living their values and bringing them into what they do, how can they go about that? And what's your experience in that area, Vivek?
Sorry, I didn't get your question very clearly. Can you repeat it for me?
Sure. With respect to teams, we've talked about it, organizational values and becoming clear on it and having conversations, but at a team level, at a very team level, what can a group of people do to enact those values, to have conversations about those values?
So first and foremost, I think there is, as Dr. Mary said, there is a big importance of storytelling. And besides what has been said, my personal understanding is that storytelling also helps you understand your role and also get some insights. Just to give you an example, okay, there was a strike in one of the companies, and when the strike ended, the managing director called for a meeting of senior managers and asked them a very interesting question. The question was that we are paid to run the company. Where did we go wrong? Okay, now this is a this question, the managers did not even expect that such a question was coming their way, and it forced them to reflect. Now, whenever there are deep conflicts, this question plays on the minds of people in that company, where when they say that, well, we are paid to do the certain thing, okay, where did we go wrong? What I'm trying to say is that even in team setting, okay, the storytelling has a very important part, and that's how they get transmitted. As far as teams are concerned, I think it is better that they define their operational values, and they also focus on them. These are essentially intangible things, and they should avoid the popular trend of quantifying everything. I think the whole idea should be to create dialogues and to get insights that stay with us. I think that will work.
And I know, Stella, you're a champion of the analytics side, so I'll be interested of your other side of the coin there.
I'm champion of a balanced approach. I think you really need to tailor the story to the audience. So if the CFO is only going to react to things that have monetary value attributed to it, that's the story you need to tell, and link the rest of it to things that they will be able to wrap their head around, make decisions. But absolutely, stories carry the values and carry the emotional attribution we as human make to them, carry the inspiration, and a lot of those cannot be really quantified. They just spoken wisdom and inspiration of the next generation to leave them by.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think one of the interesting things about stories, or about narrative in general, is that, understanding how you craft a story, understanding how you craft a narrative allows you to look at the same set of facts and come up with a different interpretation of what's possible. And so I think that that's what the folks that I interview who actually do find ways to be persuasive and influential around values conflicts in their organizations, they're looking at the same facts that their colleagues are looking at, but they're framing a story that makes something feel possible that didn't otherwise. And so I think having that understanding about how you craft that story can be a really useful tool.
I'm really interested to bring Kavi in at this point and share with us what he sees as the key themes that have been emerging in the conversation so far. And thank you so much to everyone who's been contributing in the chat, making this a really active and dynamic conversation. And there's a few questions that we haven't got to. But Kavi, what's the red thread that you've seen coming up in today's conversation?
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and what we've seen is the importance of stories, the importance of dialogue, the importance of being authentic, the importance of keeping values at the very center of several things that we do, even though it may or may not be seen as important. These are things that have come up for me, and I think Mary, Vivek, and Stella have come at it from very different angles. It's been fascinating for me to just sit here and absorb all of this, and I think what it leaves people who have joined the conversation today is a sense of possibility and inspiration. That's one of the things that came up in the chat as well, which is, do you always have to make it a prescription, or can it also be a route to inspiration? Can it also be a route to, can it give us energy? And those are some aspects that leaves me thinking as well. And I'm sure as we close this conversation, I'll turn it over to you and to the panelists here to think about that aspect of how can values infuse energy and action and passion into an organization. No, to you.
Yeah, thank you. And the same question for our panelists of what do they think has been the common theme that's been emerging in today's conversation. over to you first, Mary.
Well, I guess what's the top of mind right now is reacting to what Kavi was saying about, can it be inspirational? Does it have to be negative? I think sometimes the way we talk about values is we talk about them as a bunch of thou shalt nots, a bunch of constraints on action. You can't go this far, you can't go over the line, and I think that one of the things that makes it really effective in organizations is to reframe that conversation, which is what I try and do with my work, where it's less about constraints on action and more about can do. It's like, how could I act on my values and be effective and be successful? And so framing the question differently, I think that it taps into Stela's reframing, it taps into Kavi's conversation as well. So I guess that's what I would take out of this, is the importance of moving from thou shalt not to can do, but in a values-driven context. I think of it as an entrepreneurial approach to values.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Stela?
I'll add to that. I love that. And I think another opportunity for framing is to move the values as something organization should give you as an individual, and owning it and saying, I have values as a worker, as somebody who's been educated or had lived experiences, has been surrounded by wisdom of ancestors. All of those things shaped who we are and the values that guide us. If I live and I influence my realm of impact with those values and they're inspiring others, I think that will create a contagion factor. And the more people can be inspired or feel compelled to live their values by seeing you being okay with that, and I think the more likely you'll be able to create a bottoms-up approach. And at the core, I think we all are respectful, we all want similar things, and we all can influence a positive change and not necessarily be at the mercy of somebody pushing down you shall not statements on us.
Yeah.
Vivek?
Yeah. So I feel that conversations are important, and your values really are seen by people in some of the critical moments that you face or your organization faces. But we stop there and we don't really talk about those critical moments, how they were managed or handled, or what exactly happened. And I feel that it's important to talk about that. One is part of storytelling, the other is part of these leave a mark. These leave a mark on the psyche of people. Unfortunately, we stop at storytelling and we don't go to the final stage of, so what values we have actually practiced. So I think that next stage also needs to be covered as a part of storytelling. But I see dialogue and storytelling as the most important things, because it helps people understand that there are many possibilities of managing difficult situations and regular work as well. So in that sense, it gives them clear idea about what values are in practice.
Thank you, Vivek. And there's still plenty of questions emerging in the chat, of which Mary and Stela have answered, and I'm highly impressed at your ability to get those answers out so quickly, both of you. One of the things is that the recent interviews for Vivek, Mary and Stela are on our website, and links to their work, including all of their things that they've written, their books, etc., are on those posts. I'll just ask Deepa to just post the link to our Flyntrok LinkedIn page. We invite everybody to connect with us there. you'll find all of the interview series that we've had with all of our panelists today. And as one of the questions was about any resources with respect to templates, etc., Mary's given the link there, but it is also on the YouTube channel where Mary's interview is, but also on our website, you'll find a blog post with respect to Mary's work and links to her work at the bottom of the page. We'd like to thank everyone very much for joining us today. Automatically, for those of you that are here today, we'll be adding you to our newsletter that goes out on a regular basis, and any of our stories with respect to our values will be there. And we've also done a few blogs in the past that talks about the research around values and the impact of living values around commitment, and a range of other research data points that we've collected over the last years or so. So thank you so much for joining us, and it's been a great pleasure to have you all here today.